The Council conducted a study recently on practices which hinder competition within American industry. During this question and answer session with reporters, the group released the results of its study and recommended various policy changes. The Council on Competitiveness is a coalition of chief executives from business grouped together with university and labor union leaders.
Good morning. My name is Kent Hughes. I'm president of the Council on Competitiveness, and I wanted to welcome you to this morning's press conference where we're releasing the report, Capital Choices, Changing the Way America Invests in Industry. Capital Choices is the product of a joint effort by the Council on Competitiveness and the Harvard Business School. I think you'll find it is the seminal description of the American system of allocating private capital. Special thanks for this whole project go to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which gave us a very generous grant to pursue this research. And the person of the hour who pulled all this work together is sitting just to my immediate right, Michael Porter. In addition to being a professor at the Harvard Business School, his real life is as an executive committee member of the Council on Competitiveness. And to Michael's right is George Fisher, who's our chairman, and in addition, CEO and chairman of Motorola.
Today, the Council on Competitiveness is really pleased to be releasing the study that Ken alluded to, Capital Choices, Changing the Way America Invests in Industry. This report gets to the heart of many of the problems we see facing us today in the United States, and it talks to what we must do to succeed against the best competitors this nation has in the world. The study deals with the allocation of capital, quite simply, and what that means to our economy. Indeed, that large pool of capital which this nation possesses is one of our greatest resources, and I think you would all agree with that. That capital can, in fact, be viewed as the primary tool that is used to improve both industry and, equally importantly, society in general. The way we invest those resources determine the health and future welfare of not only our businesses, but also the citizenry of this country. Investment, obviously, is also key to our participation in international markets, and that's why in this study we focus so much on comparisons with Japan and Germany, our primary international competitors. The report refers to capital in a very broad sense, in the intangible as well as the tangible. Part of capital being employee training and supplier-customer relationships. Those of us in the business community have for a long while, I believe, recognized the importance of those types of intangible capital investments. The Capital Choices project, which we're talking about today, began actually about 2 years ago when the Council on Competitiveness and the Harvard Business School joined forces to examine the way the capital is invested in the U.S. industrial base. Professor Michael Porter has directed the project from its start and, in fact, authored the report that you will be receiving or have received. In addition, the Council formed an advisory group headed by Henry Schack, CEO and chairman of Cummins Engine, and including members of labor, industry, and education to make sure there was real-world relevance to the findings in the study. 25 scholars assembled by Michael submitted 18 papers which addressed the topics, and these get into some very fundamental questions. How are businesses in fact operated? How do they invest? How are decisions made? How are priorities established? And certainly, what impact do those decisions have on the competitiveness of businesses, on job creation or elimination, on the economy, and most importantly, on society in general and the standard of living we have? As the project evolved, it became very clear to Michael and to the rest of us that there are, in fact, an interconnected series of influences which Michael refers to as a national system, with emphasis on system, of capital allocation. To contrast with other national systems, each paper has addressed comparisons with Japan and Germany. I should note at this point that not all members of the Council on Competitiveness agree with every detailed finding in this report. In fact, that would be asking far too much. And rather than design by committee, we chose to endorse this report because the Executive Committee really believes that this is an unprecedented and extremely rich body of study and findings. And it is important that we all look at it as a study in the whole and not fragment it as a discrete set of conclusions or recommendations. The Council is very enthusiastic about this study and its findings, and we will indeed use it as a platform for further debate and deliberation. We hope that both the public and the private sectors in this country study it thoroughly and in complete detail and take its findings very seriously, if not endorse all of its recommendations. In concluding, as Kent said, I'd like to thank the Alfred Sloan Foundation for their support of this project. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School, who will present the findings of the study. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming this morning and joining us to launch this effort, which has taken us a considerable amount of time to do, but I hope that it will be worth the effort. There's been a widespread concern that you're all very familiar with, that America is facing a competitiveness problem. And there's been a search for causes for that problem. Prominent among the diagnoses for America's competitiveness problem has been a series of influences related to our capital system. The assertion that we have a short time horizon in American industry, that America has a short-term bias. The sense that we have a high cost of capital, and that high cost of capital is making it impossible for our companies to invest enough. That high cost of capital frequently linked to the low savings rate in the country. There's been widespread concern about the corporate governance system in the United States, the way in which investors interact with companies. Indeed, there's widespread dissatisfaction with the system and a lot of finger pointing. Investors accuse management of wasting assets, of paying themselves too much, of not listening. Managements accuse investors of churning stocks, of not having the interest of the company at heart, of simply being short-term players. There's been a great deal of anecdotal discussion of this issue, but about 2 years ago, we on the Council and at the school decided that it was time to do some serious research on the question, to try to pull together the best available knowledge that we could assemble on the question of what is it that is the problem, if any, with our American system of allocating and using capital. I went around the country and found 25 leading scholars who were experts in their individual disciplines. As you will read when you look at the report, we had papers done on executive compensation, capital budgeting systems, institutional investors, the role of banks, and a wide variety of other factors that seemed important going into the study. My role has been to try to take these very rich individual papers and synthesize them into an overall view of the question. That has taken some additional research as well with the assistance of Rebecca Wayland, who works with me at Harvard Business School. What have we found? The right question is our entire national system for allocating capital, both to companies from investors and within companies to specific investment projects. We found that there is an internally consistent national system of allocating capital. It's self-reinforcing. The pieces of it reinforce each other and fit together. We found that the U.S. system is markedly different from that in Japan and Germany, both in the external market as well as within companies. We found that our U.S. system is not serving the nation well. It's not allocating capital in enough cases to the right companies, and especially it's not allocating capital to the right forms of investment. It's not as much a problem of how much capital there is in the United States. Indeed, the United States, as George said, has an enormous pool of capital. The problem is how we deploy that capital and where we deploy that capital. We underinvest in some areas, we overinvest in others, like acquisitions. We also tend to underinvest in precisely those forms of investment, such as employee training, such as supplier relationships, which are increasingly crucial to international competitive advantage. All the constituencies in the U.S. system, the regulators, the managers, the employees, the investors, are trapped in a system in which all is acting rationally, given their goals and given their circumstances, but none is satisfied. We have managers complaining about investors, we have investors complaining about managers, we have employees fearful of the role of investors in takeovers, and so forth. We found that the system in place in the United States is our own creation. We actually had a very different structure in the early part of this century, but through a long series of regulatory choices, often with unintended consequences, we have created a structure with these costs to our economy. The problem has grown slowly as there have been important changes in our regulatory pattern in the last 20 years. But also it's important to recognize that the existence of the problem today is in no small part due to the fact that global competition has substantially increased over the last 15 or 20 years, so that American companies have been brought into increasing contact with companies based in other systems. In a closed economy, your capital allocation system is much less sensitive. When you open your economy to international competition, then if your system creates biases or disadvantages, they are much more important. We found that there are many proposals out there today to improve the U.S. system, such as eliminating quarterly reports, such as putting more outsiders on the board, such as banning takeovers. But we find that many of these proposals are actually counterproductive. They would actually produce the opposite result of what is sought. Why? Because they're treating a symptom. They're not getting at the underlying reasons why the various constituencies are behaving the way they are. Reform must recognize the systemic character of this problem. A series of changes are required. And each of the constituencies is going to have to give up something. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If managers are going to want investors to be more committed to the company and more informed about the company's health, then managers are going to have to open themselves to greater scrutiny than our current system provides. If investors are going to want to have more power and influence over management, investors are going to have to be more committed and more informed, and so on. It's important, however, to understand, and I think, and indeed stress, however, that the U.S. system has very important strengths. It's not that it's uniformly a weakness. It's more flexible, it's more responsive, it's fairer, there are more independent decision makers out there making choices in a more transparent way. And indeed, we believe that the underlying potential of the U.S. system is actually to be the superior system for allocating capital. We find potent weaknesses in the Japan and German systems as well, which I'll speak about a little bit later. We believe, however, that if our U.S. practices are reformed, our system provides a better foundation for an ideal system. There's much talk today about Germany and Japan having a superior form of capitalism. We find that that's not the case. We believe that the American system has the better foundation and with appropriate steps, it can indeed prove to be the superior form of capitalism that we all hoped it would be when we started this endeavor. The fundamental starting point for our findings is that competitiveness is a function of the ability of companies to continually improve and innovate. You're competitive not because you have cheap labor or because you have low-cost raw materials. Those are readily available today on world markets. You're competitive because you can improve and innovate to produce innovative products and processes. The world leaders in all major industries are firms that can do this. The Japanese are winning in automobiles because they're more innovative, because they're improving at a more rapid rate. Competitiveness then depends fundamentally on investment. Because in order to improve and innovate, you've got to invest. You've got to invest aggressively and continuously. But when we think about investment, we've got to think broadly about it. Investment is not just hard assets. Investment also includes things like training your employees, like doing R&D, like building relationships with your suppliers, like penetrating foreign markets to get the advantages of access to those markets, which may take many years of losses. There are many forms of investment. What we found is that the intangible forms of investment, the training, the R&D, the supplier relationships, the intangible forms are of growing importance to competition. Increasingly, lots of people have the same hard assets. It's how well you use those assets, it's how efficiently you deploy those assets that determines your ultimate success. It's intriguing, however, to recognize that these very intangible investments that are so important are not treated as investments on corporate books. You don't get to capitalize training and R&D anymore. Those are expensed. And that provides an intriguing window into what I think proves to be an important problem. Our classical way of thinking about investment is that you invest in a bunch of discrete projects. You know, you build a plant here, you build a product there. But what we found was that the nature of investment in modern competition is rather different than that. Investment today takes place through a series of complementary forms of investment that take place simultaneously. Now, General Motors has invested vast amounts of money in new plant and equipment in the last 10 years. They haven't done that well. Why not? Because they didn't make enough parallel investments in training and redesigning their process and so forth. Today, you can't think of investment as a series of discrete projects. You have to think about it as an endless sequence of complementary projects that are linked to each other. The payoff for one investment often depends on making some other investments at the same time, to say it another way. We also found, and this is, I think, well accepted by economists, that the returns to investment often go beyond the firm itself. There are social returns to investment that are not measured always on the corporation's books. Investment in employee training, for example, may lead to much more skilled employees who have many more opportunities going forward. That doesn't show up directly on the company's books. Investment may lead to improvements in the capabilities of suppliers, and it may allow those suppliers to earn higher profits. But that doesn't necessarily show up on the corporation's books. As we look at national systems for investment, we have to look at how well they align the private returns to investment and the social returns to investment. And one of the things we found is that both the Japanese and German systems are far better at aligning those two things than our U.S. system is. Now, the U.S. system has weaknesses, but as I said earlier, there are very important trade-offs to recognize. Our system is very good at quickly reallocating resources. It's opportunity seeking. It's upside chasing. Our system is able to capture emerging businesses. We're very quick into biotechnology and into local area networks or whatever the latest thing is. Our system generates higher private returns per period. The average profitability of U.S. industry is substantially higher than Japanese and German industry. Our public market is pluralistic, it's fair, it's better informed than the public market in Japan and Germany. As I've said earlier, however, our system has a tendency to underinvest, especially in tangibles. It's acquisition biased. It overinvests in profitable mature companies with few attractive investment opportunities. It relies on costly takeovers as the principal form of management discipline. Since the owner has no direct influence on management, is not on the board, has no clout, the only way that we really discipline poorly performing managements in our system are takeovers, and those are very expensive in lots of respects. For the companies, perhaps for the employees, for society as a whole. Wouldn't it be better if we could find a less radical approach to monitoring and ongoing management team? The Japanese and German systems are very good at continual, relentless investment to build productivity in their existing businesses. They're not, they just keep investing and investing and investing. Their system is prone towards internal diversification into related businesses, to redeploy people, to keep that permanent employment going. Their systems, we think, are better aligned with social returns, because they bring management and employees and owners together, align their goals better, and better capture these externalities. However, the Japanese and German systems have a tendency to overinvest, proliferate products, stay in businesses too long. They're a little slower getting in emerging fields. Because of the lack of individual incentives within the corporation, they have poor performers who are never weeded out. They have real trouble exiting anything. In Japan, you never see exits. People just stay in even if they have 1% market share, and their public markets are less well developed. Now, just to summarize, we believe that this is an internally consistent system we have in the United States. It's different. To reform the system, we're going to have to get at a series of these influences simultaneously. We can't tinker at the margin. We believe that all the constituencies, management, institutional investors, and government, have to change, and that each can change independently of the other, at least to some extent. That managers don't have to wait for Washington to keep up. Washington doesn't have to wait for institutional investors to keep up, and so on. There are many counterproductive proposals out there. As I've said earlier, we believe, for example, that eliminating quarterly reports would make no difference whatsoever. It would just make investors less informed. It wouldn't change their goals. It wouldn't change the way they approach valuation. It wouldn't change at all their tendency to sell. It wouldn't change their lack of influence on management. It would simply treat a symptom. We believe that more stock options are not necessarily a good idea if stock options simply accentuate the attention of management to current share prices, and current share prices carry the cost that we've discussed earlier. More outsiders on the board of directors is not going to make any difference if outsiders are not that well informed and own little of the company and are relatively ineffective in forcing changes in management behavior. We also believe that the indirect approaches to solving the investment problem, like direct government investment in industry, carry risks that are worth at least pausing, if not avoiding.